Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one's going to be the ongoing negotiations between the Armenian government and the regime in Baku. The second one's going to be the ongoing assault on the town of Yeraskh on the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan by the Aliyev regime. And lastly, we're going to cover the 6-month illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. Let's start off with an update on the negotiations between Armenia and the Aliyev regime. What was interesting this week is that the regime in Baku asked for a delay in the summit that was supposed to happen in Washington, D.C., supposedly over scheduling issues, which is most likely a lie. In trying to figure out why they would ask for this delay, there's only two possible likely reasons. The first one's obviously they're interested in the process and not in peace. They just want to keep this thing going as long as possible without essentially saying that we're not interested in peace and we're never going to sign anything. But the second and most likely reason is because this was the week that the famed Ukrainian counteroffensive started in the war with Russia. And most likely what they're waiting to see is what the results of that counteroffensive is, if it leads to a collapse in the Russian positions or it does not. So far, the results have been inconclusive or rather unfavorable for the Ukrainian side. Now, why is this important? I think people have a tendency to misunderstand the relevance of the Ukraine war to this current crisis and conflict between Armenia and the Aliyev regime. It is inconceivable, I think, for the Aliyev regime to throw the Russians under the bus unless there's a complete Russian defeat in Ukraine or a complete collapse of the Russian positions. Because obviously, if he signs anything, any of the Western-oriented peace deals, he would essentially be doing that, which is one of the reasons that we're not likely to see any kind of a peace deal that's going to be signed over the next couple of months or even years. This was followed up by a continued aggression across the board, constant shooting at different border positions, attacks on Artsakh. So they've been actually ramping up their military aggressions across the board. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is the assault of the Aliyev regime on the town of Yeraskh, which is on the border with Armenia and Nakhchivan. For a few days, Aliyev's forces have been firing Armenian military positions, and what sort of brought this thing to another level was them assaulting a construction site of a metallurgical plant that was being constructed. This is a U.S. investment of something around $70 million, and they actually targeted the construction site. By attacking that site, they actually injured 2 Indian construction workers that were working on that site. This is actually quite telling because the reason they're doing this is because this is a U.S. investment. And the fact that a U.S. plant is being built in that location is something that is quite problematic for the Aliyev regime because it's going to make the cost of any future aggressions much higher because it obviously brings the attention of the world. You know, we had discussed about mining for security. This is actually investments for security. In the short run, what's been declared is that the company is going to suspend construction, which is a huge mistake. What the response should be is that the government should guarantee the investment. This thing should move ahead aggressively. You have to also put the largest U.S. flag in the world on top that can be seen from 20 kilometers away. And frankly, this is the best evidence of the fact that the regime in Baku is simply not interested in peace. Here they are attacking sovereign Armenian territory, not even a military site, attacking a construction site for the purposes of not allowing foreign investment because they know foreign investment makes future aggressions much harder. Now we're going to move on to the last most important topic of the week, which is the 6-month anniversary of the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh. Let's look at the facts here. You have a regime that wants to ethnically cleanse a population it does not like. This is in Europe in the 21st century. For 6 months, they have cut them off from the world, essentially holding them as hostages. And they do control what food people get to eat, what they don't get to eat. They've cut them off entirely from their gas supply. They've cut them off from electricity. They've cut them off from access to healthcare services. They have limited their water supply, and they keep disrupting agricultural work by shooting at farmers wherever they can. All of this essentially without any consequences. Now let's work our way across to what I call the walk of shame to see what the response has been to this from Armenia and from around the world. Let's start off with the Armenian government's response. This is the Armenian government in Armenia. Frankly, it's easy to judge them. I think one of the problems with the critics of this government is they don't really understand how limited some of our options are. But even in that context, I think there's a lot to be desired and a lot more aggressive actions that need to be taken. In order to judge the mistakes of this government, first of all, I think we need to clearly understand what the intentions of the enemy are. In the long run, it's ethnic cleansing and no peace agreement. And in the short run, it's the normalization of the blockade and no peace agreement. Why the normalization? Because the normalization of this blockade is essentially occupation by another name. If you actually can control who goes in and who goes out, and you can do so without any punishment from anyone, it's the same thing as invading Artsakh. There's really no difference between the two. If we are interested in peace, which I think this government is, the lifting of the blockade cannot be the last thing you're focused on. In fact, it needs to be the first thing that it needs to be focused on. Minus the lifting of the blockade, the other side has absolutely no reason to negotiate for anything because they're already getting what they want and their aggressions on the ground are going unpunished. Frankly, from a legal, and a moral, and a political point of view, the blockade is also their point of weakness. This is something that is pretty much universally condemned around the world. It's actually been condemned by international law and by international courts. And lastly, I think it's impossible to get away from the centrality of Artsakh on this negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's really the heart of the matter, and there's no side stepping it. All of our partners must understand that actually the blockade is nothing but a frontal attack on the peace process itself. So first you have to deal with the blockade, then you move on to peace, not the other way around. I think what this government should do is to far more aggressively, again, go back to the Security Council to force the internationalization of this issue, even if it means a Russian veto, because it's going to put them on the spot. Secondly, is to actually use the illegal blockade as the prima facie example that this is a group of people that are in risk of genocide, that you need to move on towards other options, whether it's the Kosovization of the process, whether it is earned sovereignty or half a dozen different other legal formulas. But it is something where the regime has to feel the heat, otherwise they have no reason to negotiate. Lastly, and I think what I take offense to, is this government's and the Prime Minister specifically very offensive lectures to the people in Artsakh, demanding them not to interfere with his peace process, whatever that is, and to negotiate directly. Negotiate directly exactly with who and under what conditions. Let's move on to the current Armenian opposition. If given the concessions that this country has made and this government has made to the other side, while getting nothing in return, and you can use this politically to strengthen yourself, what are you really good for? It's fair to say that if being ineffective was any kind of a blessing, you would all be saints. Let's move on to our diaspora. Your failures in this case are actually epic. In the three countries in the world where they're the largest Armenian diasporas, in 2 out of the 3 of them, which is France, Russia, and the United States, the position of those governments are actually entirely hostile to Armenia, as it is in Russia. Positive in France, and again, mostly pro-Aliyev in the United States, which is absurd given the wealth and the strength of the Armenian American community. The Russian diaspora has an excuse. They don't live in a democratic country, but the US diaspora has no such excuse. All we have gotten from the United States diaspora and its institutions are a couple of meaningless resolutions that have been introduced in the United States Congress. And all of this in the context of massive human resources that exist there. It's very hard to go to any public relations firm, a large corporation, or Wall Street and not have significant Armenians in all kinds of positions, and none of those resources have been used to help the people of Artsakh. Let's move on to the reaction of our international friends. Let's start off with the Russian state. Your treachery and betrayal of this country and of Artsakh is something that is not going to be forgotten or forgiven. To make sordid deals with a here today, gone tomorrow fascist regime in Baku while holding 120,000 Armenians hostage is something that will shame your country just as much as your foolish invasion of Ukraine. What you've done for this country, what you have done to this country is something that you will regret for many decades to come. Let's move on to our American friends. Your excuse for not doing it on the blockade or opposing it or acting against the regime in Baku is not to interfere with your sacred peace process, which is not going to go anywhere. The only problem is that your peace process does not provide electricity, gas, food for the people of Artsakh that need to live on the short run. If you claim to care about the rights and security of the people of Artsakh, which you've constantly said needs to be part of the negotiations between Stepanakert and Baku, lifting the blockade is actually the first step in reaching that goal, or actually reaching the peace process that you're actually interested in resolving. I have a question for Secretary of State Blinken. You know, if there was 120,000 Israelis that were being held hostage by Hamas, would your reaction be they need to wait? They need to be patient so that the peace negotiations can go on and reach the process, reach the end that you want to have a complete settlement of the issue as they're being blockaded. And if anybody thinks this is a stretch as far as examples, it actually isn't. In the Hamas charter, it calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. And Aliyev has constantly not only calls for the destruction of the Armenians of Artsakh, actually for the Armenian state itself. So there's actually no difference between the two. Now let's move on to our European friends, and I'm going to play you a speech that was made by Ms. von der Leyen.
The playbook of Russia's aggression against Ukraine comes straight out of another century, treating millions of people not as human beings, but as faceless populations to be moved or controlled or set as a buffer between military forces, trying to trample the aspiration of an entire nation with tanks. This is not just a matter of Ukraine's survival. This is not just an issue of European security. This is putting our whole international order into question. And that's why countering Russia's aggression is a task for the entire global community.
So, Ursula, please explain to us what is the difference between what Putin is doing in Ukraine, according to your description, and what Putin and Aliyev together are doing to the people of Artsakh. Whatever you accuse of Putin doing in Ukraine, Aliyev has already done against Armenia and Artsakh. But after all of that, Putin is somehow an outlier, while the gutter scum in Baku is treated with red carpets. You know, there's been 10 rounds of sanctions against Russia and not a single one against a gangster in Baku. In conclusion, you know, we constantly hear EU leaders, and specifically Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister, and Ursula von der Leyen, talking about their frustration that the global south, or most of the rest of the world, does not support their efforts against Russia or is not aggressively supporting Ukraine. To paraphrase Shakespeare, the fault, dear Ursula, is not in your stars, but in yourselves. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Well, if I needed you, would you come to me? Would you come to me and ease my pain? If you needed me, I would come to you. I'd swim the seas for to ease your pain. Well, in the night forlorn, all the morning's born, and the morning shines with the lights of love.